So I heard about this guy who asked his grandfather, said, Zaida, tell me something. After 65 years of marriage, you're still calling Baba, honey, darling, my love. What's the secret? And he said, well, because 5 years ago, I forgot her name. I don't want to ask her anymore now. So I want to talk to you today about what's your name? What's your name? That's the title for this sermon. It's interesting because you probably know by now that in Judaism, names are very powerful, right? God is assigning names, changing names, and every time we meet a new character in the Torah, the name is going to tell us a lot about that person. And when the name gets changed, it also is going to tell us a lot about the new mission for that person. Names are very important, very personal. It connects us to our tradition, to our families. For example, let me give you an example. And I was thinking about this lately. My mom, if she introduced herself to you, she would say, my name is Rina, right? And I also knew she was Rina, my mother. And until one day I realized that was not her name. Her name was Beatriz. I said, Mom, it's not even close. Well, my parents wanted to name myself Rina. But it was not allowed in Argentina back in the day, where they had a list of pre-approved names to use. It doesn't exist anymore. Now it's more open, but back in the day, that's what it is. So they went with Beatriz just to make the government happy. But then after that, everybody called her Rina, right? So I was thinking that these two names, whenever she uses one or the other, has two very different emotional implications. Rina is a happy name. It's a name that her parents wanted to give her. So it's a connection with family. It's a connection to the love of her parents. Beatriz, in the other side, is a connection to a legality, to a formality. So it doesn't have the same power. So names are very important, not just in Jewish tradition, but I would say in life in general. When you get a nickname that you like, it's great. When you get a nickname that you don't like, it could be very stressful. So it is interesting that we just finished a book last week that is called Shemot, names. And the book of Shemot is called names because it starts at the very beginning with the names of the 12 tribes and many other characters that we get to know along the way. But it talks about the tribes, but also talks about the individuality of each one of them and why each one of them were different and special. So yes, a name also makes you special. A name sometimes connects you. I heard names, for example, of some of my students, of some of my friends, that represents their ancestry. Because it's a name that sounds one way, but you see the spelling is because my parents were from Scotland, for example. That's why it's spelled that way. So a name has a lot to say about your identity. And that's why even back in the day, the tribes, they used to have banners identifying each of the tribe to remind you that this is your place. Okay, and your name is connected to that specific tribe and all the cultural implications that will have. So, but it's interesting also that even with the tribes, have you ever heard about the concept of Jubilee in the Torah? That every 50 years, all the properties will go back to the original tribes, which means that if along the way you forgot where you were coming from, every 50 years, like it or not, you will be reminded that you belong to a specific tribe. And of course, you will be reminded every 50 years that if you were in Israel, that you were a Jew, which is very interesting. So sometimes it's important, even if it's not through the Jubilee. Sometimes it's important once in a while to stop and to remember who you are. And I realized that for the Jewish people, most of us, we have two names. We have the names that you call it the English name, which to me didn't make any sense because many people have a name that is not in English, like myself, right? For me, it would be the Spanish name. But people say, what's your English name? I said, Anibal. And what is your Spanish name? Anibal. But we have the civil name, but also we have the Hebrew name. That is interesting because sometimes, every time I have a new student for a bar bat mitzvah, the first question I ask, what's your Hebrew name? I don't know. And you know what I tell them? Go ask your parents, and they will tell you what your Hebrew name is. And from there, sometimes it's a very interesting conversation. Really? My Hebrew name is Feivel? How did that happen? So they will have a conversation. Well, that was your great-grandfather who died in the Shoah, for example, and it will open up a whole conversation for a whole different level. But again, once in a while, like my bar mitzvah students, we forget at least part of our identity, and we forget who we really are. And it happens to all of us. And it looks like Moses was not an exception. And then it comes to this week's parsha. What happened with Moses? It says, Vayikra el Moshe. That's the very beginning of the first part of the parsha. Vayikra el Moshe. It said, God called out Moses. For those who usually follow the Torah reading, you will know that that's not the usual way for God to engage in conversation with Moses. We usually said, Vaidaber Adonai el Moshe leimor. And God spoke to Moses, and Moses listened the instructions, and then he would pass it on to the Jewish people. But it looks like for some reason, Moses didn't respond to God at this time. So God has to call him out using his Hebrew name, Moshe. Because the first time he didn't listen, second time he didn't listen, so God called him out. And there is lots of midrashim about this. Why did God have to call him up instead of just engaging conversation like it happened before? And they said that Moses was stressed out about the whole situation, about the future, about the journey. He has so many things in his head that when God called him out by his Hebrew name, he didn't react. So God had to call again, almost like knock at the door for Moses to react. So even Moses fell prey of the pressure of the circumstances, and he forgot, at least in part, of who he was and what his mission was. So I just realized that if Moses forgot, it is okay for us to forget once in a while who we are, but it's also important, just like Moses, that eventually have an opportunity to remember that we have an English name or a Spanish name or a French name, but we also have a Hebrew name that is going to tell us the other or the second half of our history. And I realize that these are very interesting times that we are going through in society, with everything that is happening in Israel, everything that is happening in Canada, everything that is happening south of the border. And everything that is happening around the world is going to affect, in different ways, our two names. Sometimes decisions made by us and other people will affect our English name, our Canadian identity. And sometimes some other things will affect our Hebrew name, our Jewish identity. So sometimes I was wondering, how do we put it together? How do we make decisions that they will satisfy both? Especially now, you will see in a few minutes, Gustavo Zedner is going to speak to us about something very important. And I'm very excited to listen to these words, because hopefully will bring some light to answer this question. How can we look forward to a future that, in my case, that Anibal Mas will feel that that it has a prosperous and joyous future, and at the same time, Yitzhak ben Yehuda Moshe will feel safe and content. How do we put the two together? It's a very good question that we all have to ask ourselves. Answering that question is a different issue, and I believe that sometimes we need some guidance.